Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to chat through some fantasy books that I think defy expectations, and this can mean a number of different things. Some of them defy expectations just in their very plots because the plots are so unique and the worlds are so unique, those sorts of things. Other ones take common tropes or common things that we see in fantasy and then flip them on their head, and then some of these defy expectations within the story itself where you think that things are going one way and then there's an amazing plot twist or something happens that is extremely unexpected. I'm going to start with one that fits within that middle category where it's the way it takes common tropes and it turns them around, and that would be the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. If you have read this, then you probably have plenty of knowledge as to how Abercrombie does this, but essentially he is taking so many of the common character types and the common themes you see in fantasy, and then he is changing them entirely. So, for example, with the characters, you have for so long had the wise mentor wizard type character, and in this he's like, what if that character had their own motivations and they were secretive, sure, but maybe not because they have some kind of really amazing here comes the cavalry type of thing in mind. You also take the idea of the strapping, handsome, young soldier who is being trained. They have everything going for them, and then you're examining what does society tend to think of those kinds of people and how do they tend to think of themselves, and are they really ever going to be the heroes? You also have characters that are battle-hardened, who have been through the most difficult of trials, and those types of characters in fantasy tend to be the ones that come out of it wanting for justice, and now they've seen the ways of the world and they're fighting for something better, but they do have that dark past. And then he's basically like, yeah, that dark past, it lives with them every single day of their lives, and rather than fighting for justice, they don't want to fight for anything now. They just want to get by. They don't want to be in pain anymore. They're bitter and they hate everything. On top of that, in most stories, you see these characters always come together, and even if they are flawed or even if they are morally gray, they often come together to accomplish something, to make something happen in the world. And Abercrombie is like, no one person is really usually that influential, so yeah, let's just see what happens. And I think the way that he does this is quite masterful. I do think that in some ways it can almost make for, this probably isn't the right word, but almost like a disappointing feeling as you're reading, because you keep waiting for these heroic moments, or you start to see character growth and you're like, oh, okay, so we are going to see the characters grow, and then they regress and you're like, oh, but I guess that's what I signed up for. And I just think that there is this strange feeling that he creates in you where you appreciate it, but you also can't help but be frustrated by it at the same time. Very, very different from that. Next up, we have The Bone Shard Daughter. In this first book, already it defies expectations in that it is not, in my opinion, purely fantasy. It's not really purely anything. I would say it's fantasy with a lot of other things mixed in. You put in some other seasoning of some other different genres. For example, I always mention that this has horror leanings to it, and some of the questions that arise as a result of certain plot lines definitely are ones that I see more often in science fiction rather than in fantasy. So there's a lot to this that already is different from what I would typically find. This one definitely falls into the it's unique just in its makeup category, but on top of that, Andrea Stewart also takes advantage of both first-person perspective and third-person perspective, and she does it flawlessly to a point where you almost don't even notice that that's what's happening for a while. You're so intrigued and a little bit confused, probably a lot confused by the plot, you're just trying to keep up, that it's almost like your brain doesn't even notice that the perspectives are different. It's more of just like, okay, here's this character and here's this character that you're in first person, you're attached to. So when you do get the third person perspectives, it's more like, here's this other thing going on in the world that's mysterious, and you think, well, that was mysterious. You don't think, that was third person, huh? And I just really respected how she utilized those in ways that I don't typically find. And on top of all of that, there are mystery components to the story. You have a character who has lost her memories, which is fairly common in fantasy. You see characters that have memory loss and they're uncovering what's happened. You've seen that before, but how this one unfolds, I think, is different and defies expectations. And in general, I think that the magic system itself and this world is quite unique. I really, really, really loved this first book. I really enjoyed the second book. And at the time I'm filming this, the third book will be coming out very soon, and then it'll be a completed trilogy, and I am so hoping to love that third book. And if I do, I probably will not stop talking about it to all of you because these first two books are phenomenal. Next up, we have Strike the Zither. This defies expectations in a way that may result in you about halfway through the book being like, what? I don't like this. Or you might be like, wow, that was different. And so I can see it going either way. While I was reading it, when I got to a certain point, I was really surprised and I thought, well, what the heck are we going to do for the rest of the book? Is this actually happening? I don't know if this is happening. I guess that this is happening. I don't know how I feel about this. And then I kept reading, and on one hand, I respected what the author did, the bold choice that she made. And on the other hand, I was really unsure, and I at first was thinking, I don't think I like this. But the more I read, the more I actually did quite like it, so it resulted in a positive for me. And I can't say too much else because this is one of those where a certain set of events turns things around, and if I elaborate too much, then it would be a spoiler. So I obviously don't want to spoil it, but there's a while where you're reading it and you're like, what are we doing? Like after a while I was thinking, I need something to happen, something big to happen, because I feel like we're just dragging our feet, and then the big thing does happen, and it's so unexpected. So the idea of defying expectations, this book absolutely does that. And whether you like or dislike what the author does, I feel like most people likely will at least respect, like I said before, the boldness of that decision. On a similar note, we have the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. I'm mentioning this trilogy, but also Second Era you can say similar things about. I'm going to start with thoughts on the first trilogy though. So I'm holding up the second book specifically because while there are a lot of things that are unexpected, while there are a lot of tropes that Sanderson, in the very nature of how they're usually used, transform them into something new and interesting, while that is true, I also think that there are plenty of moments where you think something is going one way, where you think you have a firm grasp on everything, and then other things occur and suddenly you kind of can't help but be swept off your feet. I do think that even if the trilogy ends up not being for you, that there are just so many things about it that have, I think, almost started a new subgenre of fantasy. I don't know too many other fantasy books that we so strongly thought about the concept of rules and limitations for until Mistborn. Mistborn has such rigid rules and limitations, and it talks about things in such a blunt way. For a lot of people, it might take the whimsical factor and the magical factor out of magic in fantasy books, but I think that it really takes what fantasy typically had with its magic, and it now has made it so that reviewers will talk about magic systems and the rules and limitations. People will talk about, yes, but I wasn't firm on how this worked, or I thought that this was a little too loose and a little too soft for my liking, and it's now a talking point, and it gets considered when people are dissecting books and talking about whether or not a fantasy book is doing something new or original, or if it even fits firmly into, is this an amazing fantasy book? So I think Mistborn has, or just a lot of Sanderson books in general, have kind of changed our expectations for magic systems in particular, and then also within the books, there's just so many twists and turns. So I wanted to highlight that. And then with Second Era, I think that he does something really interesting in that there is a reveal. I won't say when, I'll just say there's a reveal at one point, and it's almost across books. So there's big reveals that happen at the ends of series where everything comes together and you have these big aha moments, but kind of tucked away within the series, I'm trying to be vague, kind of tucked away within the series, there's a moment where you thought a certain plot line was dead, and then that plot line, it turns out, was not necessarily gone, and you're like, wow, well, that was surprising. And again, the very title of this video, it defies expectation. The last one that I want to point out would be The Promised Neverland. I'm just going to talk about the first season of the adaptation, and really just the first episode. So when you first start watching The Promised Neverland, if you do watch it, when it first starts, you can tell there's some kind of sinister thing occurring within the story, but you don't really know what it is. And just how sinister it is turns out to be quite a surprise. So you're watching it and you're like, huh, what's going on with these kids? What's going on with these cute, sweet little orphans? They just want a family. What happens when somebody does want to adopt them? And then by the end of the episode, you're like, what the heck? And then you have to keep watching. I know not everybody who loves fantasy, it's not this 100% overlap where everybody who loves fantasy also loves anime and manga. But that first season of that show is done. It's done so well, and it really does. Really, it takes what you expect to happen, and it really flips it on its head. I was trying to find new ways to say the same thing, but that's the best way to define it, is it just flips your expectations on their head, and it does it really quick, and it hooks you, and it makes you want to keep going. That's it, though, for some fantasy books that defy expectations. I have a lot of other ones that fall under this same concept, so if you'd like me to do a part 2 to this, just let me know, and let me know what fantasy books you think defy expectations. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.